Last lecture, we talked about the Vatican. And now what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the Sistine Chapel, which is actually a smaller chapel off to the side. And in order to do that, we need to talk a little bit about Michelangelo. And he's one of the Mutant Ninja Turtles, and he's also really like a weird, moody guy, especially the way that he's depicted by other people and how he's written about. There's a really wonderful book about him called The Agony and the Ecstasy by Irving Stone. It's it's a rat killer. I mean, it's a really thick book, but basically it's a wonderful book. And I bet if you started reading it, you would be so entranced with it that you would keep going and you'd want to keep reading it. It's really well written. So basically, a lot of my information about Michelangelo is based on this fictional biography about him, but a lot of it is also based on scholarly study that I've done about him. And he's a little of a bit of an enigma. And so, if you look at the sculpture by de Volterra, he basically is describing or showing Michelangelo as this sort of dark, moody character. And you can see that one of the things about Michelangelo and his face is he's obviously been in a brawl and his nose was broken. And this actually happened to him. And it's been documented that he got into some argument with one of the other art students while they were doing some drawings, some copies, and the guy popped him in the nose. And the reason why I bring this up, more or less, is to kind of discuss the idea that Michelangelo is this guy who was a little socially inept. He was a little angry at some points. He had trouble playing well with others. And he was also this guy who was an interesting character. And what they would call this during the Renaissance was something called melancholia or melancholic. He was a moody or dark character who was, they used to say, born under Saturn, which he was Saturnine or Saturnine. He was very dark and moody. Even the way that he depicts himself, if you look at the fresco on the right-hand side, that's actually from the Last Judgment. And some people, some art historians have conjectured that the skin of St. Bartholomew that's hanging from his hand, which is kind of a weird thing anyway, but he's holding this knife up almost as if it's almost as if he's giving God a sort of rude gesture. And you see this skin bag that St. Bartholomew has in his arms, which is an indication of his martyrdom. And in the Last Judgment, he basically is depicted as someone, that's how he was flayed alive for being a good Christian. And if you look at the face on St. Bartholomew's skin that he's holding, it looks like Michelangelo's face. And so some scholars have said, hey, this is really a self-portrait and depicts Michelangelo the way that he felt he was, and might be related somewhat to Michelangelo's relationship to the Pope in Rome. Now, the reason why I bring this up is, especially in that book, The Agony and the Ecstasy, I guess you'd say that the theme that ran through it was Michelangelo's relationship to Pope Julius and to the other popes, and how he was made or instructed to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling when he called himself a sculptor. And so he actually at one point fled town and wanted to get away from this commission of working on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and the Pope sent some soldiers after him to bring him back. Michelangelo's career actually begins in Florence, and he sculpts David, but then after he sculpted the David that we'll be studying a little bit more in depth later, he is called to Rome to work on the tomb for the Pope. And so he basically is brought to Rome, and he has this idea and this great sort of plan for what he's going to do with the papal tomb. And it has so many sculptures that I think one scholar figured it out, and it probably would have taken him 50 years by the way he was working and how long it took to sculpt each figure for him to finish this sculpture for for the tomb of Julius. And so basically, Julius sees this slow progress and sees how Michelangelo is working and takes him off the project, but not before Michelangelo has been working on one of, several of the sculptures, and actually they are still in Rome and you can look at them. And so let's take a look first at this famous sculpture that I think really depicts it. And it's really iconic for the Renaissance period. It really has a lot of great ideas behind it. So this is a sculpture of Moses, and you'll notice first of all that Moses is very muscular. So if we go into a description of this sculpture more or less from a formal point of view, you'll see first of all that this sculpture is sort of seated or half seated. It almost looks like he's about to rise and get up off of the chair. You see really deep drapery, and that the drapery around this sculpture defines the form underneath. He's got a heroic and muscular kind of body. The hair has a lot of undercutting and undersculpting in it that really brings it into high relief. The anatomy is extremely realistic and accurate, but it's also fairly idealized. There's these cool little things that he does. For instance, the hands. Moses's right hand is entwined with some drapery. That's a sort of conceit. We call that sometimes a concetto, which just literally means he's showing how skillful he is and how he can intertwine fingers with drapery and make it look realistic. The legs have wet drapery style. He also has these two horns that are coming out of the top of his head, and we'll discuss that in terms of the iconography or symbolism in just a minute, because that's actually something that comes up in Romanesque and other works of art, and even in Byzantine manuscripts, you'll see sometimes Moses has horns. The pose itself is a sort of serpentine movement. I think that Michelangelo called this the serpentinata, which basically means a serpentine sort of movement. It's almost like a seated counterpoise or contrapposto, not to be confused with true contrapposto, which is a standing pose, but this is basically a sort of counterpoise where it looks like he's rising up and about to get out of that chair. And he's got the tablets underneath his arms. You're going to see that that pose is iconic or significant because it relates to other works of art that we're going to look at in just a minute. The last thing I want to point out in terms of the iconography, and this is what we'll get into the horns a little bit too, is that Moses has a long beard, and so that is actually a sort of nod to the classical idea that people who have beards are classical philosophers. Then we also see that Moses has a beautiful body and is extremely powerful and muscular. And the reason why this is probably depicted is that he's trying to show Moses literally in the sort of classical heroic mode that he is the powerful person who has kalos. He's both beautiful inside and outside, and that the physical form reflects what his role was in the Bible. The last thing that I should point out is that the horns of light that come out of the top of his head. Now, some of you may have heard of a sort of bigoted comment that Jews have horns, and remember that Moses is a Jewish patriarch from the Old Testament, and that literally comes from a mistranslation or a misinterpretation of the Bible. Now, there's this sort of game of telephone with the past, and I think that that is really important. And the game of telephone with the past is this. In the first versions of the Bible that were in Hebrew, and probably even in Aramaic, there was a passage that described when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the tablets, he had rays of light coming out of his head. So that's literally like an aura or a halo of light around him. Then when it was translated into the Greek, it went through some kind of weird mistranslation, which described it, I think the word was cairns or something like that, which described it as horns of light. And then it went through the Latin, where it was translated again, and the mistranslation that happened between the Hebrew and the Greek stuck, and it became horns of light coming out of his head. And since Moses is a Jew, sometimes bigots say, well, Jews have horns like the devil, but it's basically a reference to this early Bible passage. Now, I think that also talking about this as a series of schema and correction and seeing where Michelangelo got his inspiration from is really, really important. So on the left-hand side, we can actually see a sculpture by Hagisandros and Polydorus and Athenodorus of Rhodes called Olaquon and His Sons. And I won't go too much into the depth of what this depicts in terms of the iconography, but I think that the context is more important. Basically, in Rome, around 1500, it was excavated in 1506. Michelangelo was there and he saw this thing and he was like, wow, this is really a crazy good piece of sculpture. And he thought, hey, I'm going to use some of the ideas from this. And if you look at how the central figure of Laocoon is posed, and even the kids around him on either side, what you see literally is this sort of half-seated pose that Michelangelo kind of apes a little bit. And the torso itself and the musculature, and even the bearded head, are almost quotations in Michelangelo's representation of Moses. There's another sculpture that kind of does a similar kind of thing. So Michelangelo really believed in sort of aping or using the antique as the schema for his updated versions of sculpture. We don't know where this sculpture came from, and it's in the Vatican collection, and this is called the Belvedere Torso. But I think that what you could do, even more than the Olaquon group that we just looked at, Olaquon and His Sons, this sculpture is probably the sort of linchpin or the central hub for most of Michelangelo's work. And what I'm talking about is this was in the collection of the Vatican. He saw this thing. And if you see the torso and the legs, it doesn't have arms and it doesn't really have legs beyond basically the upper thigh. And it looks like almost all of Michelangelo's sculptures, what he does is he attaches different heads, different arms, and different legs to this sculpture, and he uses this as the model. It's kind of like this seated counterpoise, this sort of twisting and turning, almost like the figure's doing a crunch if you were going to the gym. And he uses this over and over and over again, and it was in the Vatican collection. And so he saw both the Laocoon group and he saw this Belvedere torso. And I think that these two things were probably one of the most heavily influencing works of art on his art for the rest of his life after he saw them around 1500.